Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week is the demonstration of just why clinical trials are so very important, especially in this instance where an Alzheimer's drug both shows effect and risk. The bizarre and idiotic ramifications of people believing that people who donate vaccinated blood somehow have blood not worth being transfused. Ramifications for those who have been engaging in exploitation of individuals who are trying to avoid being vaccinated, largely by selling vaccination exemptions in one way or another. The FDA approves laboratory-grown meat, and therefore we are one step closer to not needing to farm animals. Finally, there is the oldest example of a brain, although you may not recognize it as such. Alzheimer's disease is one of the big issues at the minute. It is a growing patient class, so to speak. More and more people are diagnosed with it. The problem is, there is no treatment to reverse the condition. There is no way to stop it. There are some treatments that can slow it down to a significant extent, but any decline that occurs before that point will stay. This is why the clinical trial data of lecanemab was so very important and interesting. The research shows that there was a significant improvement. Specifically, it slowed decline in cognitive function by 27% across 18 months. That's a big improvement, given that there's really no stopping it in any way, shape, or form. The problem is, nearly twice as many patients experienced brain bleeds compared to those receiving the placebo. That is approximately 17.3%. There was also 12.6 who had brain swelling compared to 1.7 in the placebo group. That's a big problem, and it does show that there's a reason why we have clinical trials. They will identify issues with things like this early on and allow for solutions to be developed, whether that is different delivery mechanisms, different targets, different active ingredients, and more. Or, if worse comes to worse, including some kind of prophylaxis for the side effects. This is where the earlier trial results are important. How do you set a standard for cognitive function, and how do you weigh that against the possible complications that we've described if they can't be corrected? And worse yet, what about those, and this is many patients with dementia, who are not identified until their condition is very advanced? Along a similar line of clinical evidence, we have blood safety, and this builds on last week's news item, where we explained that in Canada there was an increasing hesitancy to have blood from vaccinated individuals transfused, but this was in relation to adults. This week's news relates to infancy, specifically a 4-month-old boy whose parents refused to allow them to have blood from vaccinated individuals used in their surgery that would have repaired their heart. This has invariably led to the health service in New Zealand making a court application to take over the guardianship of the boy in relation to his treatment and allow the use of vaccinated blood. The parents refused to allow vaccinated blood to be used at all, and this is a problem. It's a choice between possible death or a relatively benign and otherwise completely the same blood transfusion as they would be asking for. This is like asking for the difference between water and water that's slightly colder. The parents are otherwise perfectly fine with going ahead with the surgery to fix defective heart valves, but in their words, we don't want blood that is tainted by vaccination. Somehow, one medical development in the form of corrective surgery for heart valves is fine, but vaccines are not. Talk about a first world problem. As the article explains, and as we have previously explained, blood that has been donated is very carefully screened and processed to ensure the maximum possible safety. The article even goes one step further in explaining 2 important factors. The first, that blood that has a vaccine in it breaks down that vaccine very quickly, and so the probability of there being any once a donation is made is practically nil. Assuming that there is some negligible amount left over, the second point is all the more important, and that is, blood is processed and particularly filtered so that any trace amounts that are there can pose no risk to the recipient. This is why they do not separate out those who have been vaccinated and those who have not been vaccinated. This means that there is no way of knowing who has donated blood and has been vaccinated. That means there is no way to satisfy the parent's requirement for the surgery to go ahead and prevent the child from dying. The worst part of all of this is that under normal circumstances, this surgery should have occurred weeks ago, and the longer it waits, the more risk the child is at. Still on COVID news, but at least marginally more entertaining news, it's the prison time for an individual who was selling immunization pellets. Yeah, they're a naturopath and homeopath, which should bring no surprise to anyone. The same sort of idea as being espoused by this individual is the same sort of idea behind things like memory water. Naturally, such claims did not go unnoticed for very long, and so American federal agencies did step in and they did start issuing notices to cease and desist, claiming that it was fraud. When they failed to follow through on this, they were then charged with criminal fraud. The problem is the individual profited from all of this, and really they shouldn't have, but it was in the early days of COVID-19, and there really wasn't a lot of formality to everything, or at least not the kind of formality when it comes to being able to evidence claims made. The problem with what they were doing, other than the fact that they were distributing what was effectively sugar tablets, is that they were then providing fake proof of vaccination. All of this, collectively, whether we're talking about the fraud of distributing fake medicine, the fact that they were distributing fake proof of vaccinations, and that they really weren't providing the kind of care they were claiming to provide, meant that they may well have been facing up to 25 years in jail for all of their various misconduct. Instead, they received 33 months. The best part of all of their arguments is that they basically tried claiming that they had sovereign immunity. Yeah, it's the confluence of all kinds of crackpot here, whether it's sovereign citizen, naturopathy, and, best of all, COVID-19 conspiracies. In a little over 12 months, this insanity netted them over $221,000. In another instance of alternative medicine, and hopefully yet another lesson can be learned from this, a chiropractor has found themselves in trouble because they were treating a woman who had diabetes, and the woman wound up in a coma. This shouldn't need to be said, but diabetes is caused by one of two issues, either a lack of insulin or a resistance to insulin. Generally speaking, type 2 diabetes, which is when the body becomes resistant to insulin, or type 1 diabetes, where the body destroys the beta cells that produce insulin and therefore there is none available. These are both hormonal issues related to the pancreas and the insulin receptor on various cells throughout the body. Chiropractors cannot treat hormonal regulation problems. In no way, shape, or form does the alignment of your spine have any implications for the function of your pancreas. This is why the patient, so to speak, wound up in a coma, and it was directly related to their diabetes. The initial complaint about their conduct, which should have received a much harsher penalty, only required that they adhere to the scope of practice for chiropractors under Ontario law. Not exactly much in the way of a penalty, given that they could have killed someone. Under normal circumstances, we could at least accept that a chiropractor knows nothing about what they're doing in this instance. But no, there's actual evidence in the form of text messages exchanged between the quack and the diabetic patient in which they demonstrated that what they were doing was having a negative effect. For example, vomiting multiple times during a 1-hour visit, and the chiropractor claiming that this was a good thing as it meant the acidity was leaving the patient's body. No, ketoacidosis, which is a condition arising from diabetes, when the body doesn't have the ability to use sugar, will not leave when you vomit. It is in the blood. And unless you are vomiting blood along with everything else, acid is not leaving the body, or at least not from the bloodstream. Yes, stomach acid, to a certain extent, will, but that's not related to anything else going on. And as a result, the chiropractor failed to recognize that this is what was happening, and it is why the individual wound up in a coma. The appeals board, who looked at this the second time, did conclude that the chiropractor was not taken to task for not recognizing the seriousness of his patient's symptoms, and that there is no analysis in the decision regarding whether a respondent met the standard of care required of a chiropractor in failing to advise the patient to seek further medical attention. The board found that the information in the records supports that the patient made them aware of this, and that they continued to feel well during the visit, and that they were demonstrating signs of early stages of ketoacidosis. Because they failed to send them to a hospital, or at least tell them that they should go to a hospital, they then issued a new decision. And this is not a decision that should have taken a second round of hearings. The signs and symptoms of ketoacidosis are reasonably obvious if you know what you're looking at. The fact that the pump for insulin was failing to work properly is not the point. The point is, any decent medical practitioner should have taken appropriate steps, and they did not. There is a reason why most practices are regulated, and in fact it's one of the big things the FDA does. They also are responsible for approving food, which should be to no one's surprise given they are the Food and Drug Agency. This is why they need to approve the lab-grown meat. This has recently been approved in places like Singapore, where it is being cultured without the involvement of any kind of animal, and this can satisfy some of the more ethical considerations for some people, for example, vegans. Even if the FDA has approved it, there is still at least one more hurdle, and that is the United States of America's Department of Agriculture will need to inspect the company's facilities to then approve them for the purposes of producing food. So once that's done, you may see this non-meat meat product showing up. Depending on where you live in the world, this may or may not be a significant improvement based on greenhouse gas emissions. For example, in America, a significant amount of land is used for animal grazing, and these animals will also produce significant greenhouse emissions. Once you account for the amount of feed used for them, the amount of land used for them, and the amount of greenhouse emissions, you begin to see a tipping of the scales. In other countries, this is not the case, where land that is not arable is used for growing meat animals, and so you don't actually get that loss of productive land, nor the use of feed for them. This is where the interesting dichotomy comes in. Some countries appear like they may have greater benefit from this than others, and as a result, if this gets approved in America, it will be a very good test of its popularity and acceptance into wider society. At present, Singapore is the only country where you can readily buy this sort of product. Until it is being sold in somewhere like America, we simply won't know how widely accepted it is. The final piece of news we have for you this week is archaeological, and ancient archaeology at that. A 525 million year old fossil. It's from an arthropod, and it has what is arguably one of the earliest brains found. You may not initially recognize it as that, as it is really not exactly complicated, at least not complicated in terms of the size we would think now. It is made up of the three major parts of the nervous system though, and this means that it could be part of the earliest developments, and if it is one of the earliest developments, that's important, as we can begin to build up the picture of just how it is the brain, that complex thing that lets you think and know who and what you are, developed over time, and that evolutionary process could help us to better develop other analogues, let's say. In this instance, the over 500 million year old fossil shows that there's the nervous system, and there is what would effectively be in the human, the central nervous system, largely thinking here of the spinal cord, the brainstem attached to that, the inner part of the brain, and the outer part of the brain. Those three parts of the brain are what give the complexity of the human, and for that matter, other more developed species, to be able to act and perform in complicated ways, rather than responding in the most basic way to the outside world. Although we don't yet know how definitive this is, as the method used was somewhat, let's say, creative, and understandably so. They weren't able to get the kind of detail that you would get from, say, X-rays. Instead, they had to take a series of very high-resolution photos and filter out different colors to get an idea of what's going on. This then told them what was going on in the head and brain morphology when comparing it to modern fossils and modern remains. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.